James Senegal once said, "Technology helps us become more efficient and productive, but our business still has a lot of art as opposed to strictly science." Are you tinkering, self-learning, self-improving, experimenting with home labbing? And do you want to become a skilled IT expert? Well, you've found your new home. This is the Home Labbers Podcast. On this show, we'll interview top experts and dig deep to learn how they got started and how they trained their IT skills as a master martial artist in a Shaolin temple. And you know what? We're going to have fun along the way. This is the Home Labbers Podcast. And now your host, Vian Du.
All right, let's do this.
Good morning, Home Labbers. Today I interview William. William, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me. Really excited to join for the first time.
Before we dive into the Home Lab topic, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. My name's William Lamb. I work for VMware. Almost 11 years, believe it or not. And before joining VMware, I was actually a customer of VMware for a number of years, using our technology. Dating back to sort of the early 2004-ish timeframe. This is ESX 2.5, if I recall correctly, in Virtual Center at the time. I've had a number of different roles, as a VI admin, supporting large enterprises. And more recently, my role within VMware today is part of our cloud infrastructure business group. And I kind of have internally help our product management team, our engineering teams, and our customers kind of focus around areas like our public cloud offerings like VMware Cloud Services, but also looking at our on-premises infrastructure and then sort of how does that intersect things like hybrid, local cloud, and all these different offerings and services. And I'm sure you've seen me dabbled in a lot of different areas across our VMware solutions, from storage like vSAN, NSX, and more recently things like Kubernetes as an example.
How did you get started with home labbing, and where did you get the idea?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I didn't really necessarily get into home labbing as a particular topic. A lot of it kind of stemmed from just early days of playing with VMware technology. And a lot of it was just kind of tinkering with things, trying things out. Obviously, I do a lot of automation, when I was a customer, and I still do, just to kick the tires on things. And it was really just trying to explore the technology. And I didn't always have access to, equipment from work. And so I would try to find creative ways of being able to install the VMware hypervisor ESXi into systems and doing a lot of testing. And so through that experimentation, learning, et cetera, it kind of made me aware of all the different capabilities and things you can do with vSphere specifically. And through those learnings, I've been able to kind of share that back with the community. And a lot of it ends up being, here's how you can run our software in a way that maybe it wasn't necessarily designed for. And a lot of it kind of came into more like consumer grade hardware. I think in 2012 maybe, is there were the consumer market was starting to change, and you started to see consumer systems like the Apple Mac Mini being quite powerful at that time. And so it started to give ideas to a lot of people, actually, not just myself, of like, hey, what if we could run VMware ESXi on these platforms, to make it easier for people to get access to the software so that they can learn about it and apply that to their job, right? And so it kind of grew more organically, not necessarily by design by any means. And it just kind of grew from there as I kind of play with more stuff. I had more things to share. And so kind of, still kind of continue to do that today.
What was your first home lab project?
Oh, first home lab project. I would probably say it's the my own, or more specifically, it was this lab environment that both myself and my colleague, Chuan Zhuang at the time, we were just kind of completing college. We had kind of different career paths, but he still did a lot of stuff in IT. And, during college years, we would kind of save up and have this kind of 1U Supermicro server, and we would kind of upgrade it, every couple of months, some of the hardware, getting more memory, CPU, et cetera. Right. And so I would say that was kind of like our first lab project for a number of years, actually. And a lot of that wasn't really shared externally. It was just, myself getting access to the hardware, and we started to kind of build it up. We moved it from our apartments, from, literally running in a closet. I still remember Chuan, disconnecting the closet doors at the university so that we can actually fit the system in there, add some fans, and it was just super loud, right? And so that was kind of like maybe the original genesis for just kind of kicking the tires with hardware in the early days.
How did your first home lab look?
I would say pretty fortunate because we were interested in getting certain types of capabilities. And so, we sort of invested in having fairly decent hardware. I don't remember the specs off the top of my head, but I mean, this was like a Supermicro 1U system, lots of memory. I think at one point we eventually got into the quarter terabyte, half a terabyte of memory, if I recall correctly. And, several terabytes of storage, just so that I can kind of go through and run different experiments. Right. And a lot of that, because of the home lab, has allowed me to learn a lot more about the VMware ecosystem, tooling, automation. And so for us at the time, it really was the putting in that investment kind of gave us a big ROI, right? Not only for me personally, for my career, but just being able to share a lot more with the community. So I would say that's, yeah.
Tell us entire home lab evolution story, not including what you have now.
Yeah, I think in the early days, like I mentioned, it was primarily kind of like a 1U server. This was not physically running in my home lab. So I think there was sort of that benefit that this was running in another sort of remote location. So I guess my colleague was kind of managing most of it. So, we had difficulties with things like cooling and power typically. But we kind of over time, moved away from sort of Xeon-based CPUs that were more server grade into thinking about more lower power consumption. And then over time, we had to eventually decommission that piece of hardware. We just could no longer run it for a number of different reasons. And I think that's when I started to kind of set up my own infrastructure at home. Really, really basic. I know I write a lot about home lab stuff for VMware, but if you look at my setup, it's still pretty basic. And I think transitioning that, I was using more of like Intel NUCs. This was like in the 2016 timeframe, getting interested. Mac Minis was part of my lab at some point in time, but over time I needed more different capabilities and more modern hardware. And I think been using Intel NUCs for a number of years now. The simple kind of 4x4 system. I'm looking at my system right now. I've been using the Supermicro E208D for quite some time now, and that is sort of my default go-to system. Obviously I still have kind of remote labs from VMware, and then spending some time in our VMware cloud set of offerings. So I do have access to a lot more capabilities, but for like my day-to-day stuff, it's mostly the Supermicro box, and it's only got 120 gigs of memory. So not as large as you might expect, especially coming from a much larger lab setup, mostly downsizing and then kind of the 64 to 120 gigs of memory, let's say for the probably past 5 to 6 years.
How your home lab looks right now, and what do you have now there, including the software?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, I've got the Supermicro E208D system. It's got vSAN. It's really just got 2 drives in there. I think it's like a terabyte of storage currently. It's pretty basic. Really just running the bare bone essentials of our vSphere infrastructure, doing some Kubernetes stuff. So obviously with the Tanzu aspect of it, I've got some NSX stuff deployed in another environment. And so I mean, for me, it's more like it's fairly dynamic. And so I've got the base foundation, but I might deploy different things depending on what I'm working on, et cetera. So
how did you fund your home lab?
The current home lab is something that I've purchased and own. I think in some cases, some of the components was through work, for the ability to kind of, instead of going to like a conference, I was able to get some of that funded through there. But yeah, mostly kind of self-funded for the most part.
But early days, how did you fund your home lab?
It was like work and, early days of like kind of like doing advertisements and all that. And so just whatever amount that we can kind of save up on personally, we kind of funded. So it was mostly self-funded.
How much knowledge have you gained while having a home lab?
It's hard to quantify that. I've definitely learned a lot. I think for anybody that's read my blog, williamlam.com, and kind of wonder about, some like content, things I've built, like the nested ESXi appliance, a lot of the automation and scripts, a lot of that, largely has really come from having some type of access to a home lab to be able to experiment and try these things out. So I would say a fair amount.
What is the most unforgettable home lab story you'd like to share?
There's certainly a lot. I guess the most memorable one was something that I was working on. And, I think a lot of the genesis of this project, and the project was called USB to SDDC. You can still find it's on GitHub and it still works. And, but it was a lot of the questions I get kind of from our customers around how to do certain types of automation projects. It's really interesting to talk to customers, understanding and hearing about some of the constraints, right? And it's very easy to, build automation where you're in a data center with reliable power, cooling, all the different infrastructure services that you might expect. To me personally, I think it's a lot more interesting when you actually don't have all the fancy infrastructure service. Maybe you're running at the edge, maybe your network connectivity is a little bit flaky, or you have other security requirements that make it really hard for you to say, hey, I need to automatically deploy, ESXi and vSphere into this piece of hardware, but I don't have all the different things that are available. And so I tend to like to really enjoy, understanding challenges in some of these constraints and kind of coming up with creative solutions. And so over the years, I've done various types of, installation and automation of ESXi onto bare metal hardware. And that's given me some interesting ideas over the years that kind of connect all these different smaller projects well into sort of a bigger project. And so at the time, I had a lot of customers asking, can I automate the installation of ESXi, from a USB key, but being able to deploy additional workloads, being able to deploy vCenter, all without touching anything. So I've had these questions kind of come out through the years in different variations. And I would say that it's taken me quite some time to really understand and also experiment, right? To be able to get to the point where it's like, yeah, we can definitely do that. And so don't know what kicked it off. Because ultimately I was able to demonstrate this at a VMUG. This was a VMUG and actually two VMUGs in Australia. And what we did was we basically took a super micro box like the one I have, and we basically had a USB key. And this was like closing keynote session. I did this with my buddy Alan Renouf. And what we did was like, hey, let's present on this topic. Let me plug in this USB key at the start of the presentation. Let me complete the presentation telling you, what we're going to demonstrate. And at the end of that session, which I think was like 45 minutes, give or take, ESXi would be fully installed. vSAN would be fully configured. vCenter would be deployed. And I would be able to basically connect to vCenter. That was basically the idea. And so through a lot of work, was able to make that happen. And if you look at the project, there's a lot of tiny little, tricks and things I've learned over the years because of just playing with home lab types of environments that allowed me to kind of build out this Indian solution where you literally just took a USB key, plugged it in, press the power button and walk away. So I thought that was a pretty cool live demonstration, and it kind of shows you the power of what can be done, especially when you start to think about, being able to really understand, how some of these products work, and kind of exploiting it for really cool solutions and solving pretty interesting problems out there.
Do you have any scary or funny home lab story you'd like to share with us?
Oh, never heard that before, especially scary. Well, I will take a step back. So I have this project, it's basically sort of this, community home lab project where anybody in the VMware community can kind of submit, what their lab looks like, because that's a question I get almost on a regular basis around what type of hardware can I use, costing, what are some of the constraints. And so I thought that, instead of having to answer these questions on a frequently basis, I just put together sort of this project on GitHub where anybody can submit their home lab infrastructure. So they can kind of write about, what hardware they bought, what did they spend on it? What type of software are they running on it? Just so that it helps people. And I think we have a couple hundred submissions to date, and people can get a good idea to kind of look at what people have done. One scary thing about that particular project, and let me just look it up just to make sure that I'm actually quoting the numbers right. But there is one environment in there, from Mark Hubbard. I think I'm pronouncing his last name, and he calls this a home lab. But his home lab costs $150,000 US. So at first I thought he had a typo. So I was like, hey, Mark, it's probably 15,000. I'm like, no, it's 150. And I'm sure it's probably more by now because I know he's continuously investing in it. But that was like, holy cow, like that's a pretty expensive home lab. And I think honestly, based on his equipment and kind of availability, it might even dwarf some high-end enterprise data centers in terms of the capability. So I would say that's probably both a scary and funny story I can think of.
What do you also think about you when they see your home lab?
I don't know. I've never really gotten that question before. I don't know what they think about my home lab. I honestly think it's a pretty simple home lab. I'm a pretty simple guy. My networking is very basic. I joke around not liking networking, but I need to know enough about it. But honestly, my lab is pretty set up basic. And I think my personal philosophy on home labbing is not necessarily the physical equipment. Once I've got that set up and it's running, basically vSphere. So this is ESXi and vCenter. For me personally, and for the needs that I have, that's more than sufficient. And what I mean by that is that if I need to focus on something like vSAN or Kubernetes or hybrid cloud, whatever it may be, I ended up using, nested virtualization as the mechanism for me to learn, troubleshoot, and experiment. So my home lab is more virtual than physical. Shouldn't be a surprise. And so I rely heavily a lot on nested virtualization, right? Which we didn't really talk too much about on this podcast so far, but that to me is really the mechanism in which, a lot of users should hopefully consider, if they're not already using it, to really explore home labs from a VMware point of view in the broadest sense, right? You can certainly play with VMware technology running, the hypervisor nested, but you can also play with other technologies that's not VMware and still leverage it, right? So imagine if you wanted to explore backup technologies, right? You can deploy that in a nested environment and not necessarily mess with your physical infrastructure. Same for networking, security. There's a whole set of things that you can learn from that. And so for me, the physical aspect of it isn't all that interesting. And I keep it pretty basic, as you've probably heard by now. And it's really how I use that lab is the more interesting part about it, right? And you can have a really, really basic setup that does not cost too much, and you can actually use it for so many different things and get a lot more out of it, right? So it's not about having the most expensive, most powerful lab. In fact, a lot of my day-to-day work, I only run a handful of VMs, right? I'm constantly deleting things, redeploying, and a lot of that has been simplified because I've written automation, right? So that way, if I ever need to deploy, Kubernetes with NSXT, it's a click of a button. If I need to play with Avi, it's a click of a button. So to me, the investment is really the automation piece of it to make it really, really easy. So that way you don't need a really complex physical home lab to kind of cater to those different use cases.
Let's deep dive into the nested virtualization. How did you come up with the idea to start using it?
Well, I mean, if I take a step back and I look at sort of, my career path, nested virtualization was a big part of it. Right. And really that was really enabled by VMware and the innovations that has been built by our engineering teams. And even when I was a customer, as I learned about new versions of VMware products and our hypervisor, everything would always run in nested ESXi. And that has been the case, since the very beginning, since it was made available, because at one point this technology was really only available to sort of VMware insiders. It was initially introduced, if I recall correctly, in a product called Lab Manager, right? That basically allows you to deploy these labs. This was kind of the early days of hands-on labs, right? And eventually that technology became more accessible and also well-known. And sort of when I kind of learned about nested virtualization, I was like, holy crap, like the possibilities are endless, right? And hopefully for folks who are just getting started or even have been doing VMware for many years, if you're not, using nested virtualization in every way, shape, or form, you should really think about it. And so in the early days for me, it was, how do I prepare my organization for a new version of ESX, a new version of vCenter? How do I make sure that the automation that we've written to stand up ESX continues to work? Well, I'm not going to download, a beta version of ESXi, or even when it's GA, and go through the physical aspect. I mean, just think about powering on a physical server. How long does it take? If you make one networking mistake, guess what? You got to go to the ILO, or worse, you got to go to the data center, right? So I didn't want to deal with the physical challenges of a system. We eventually have to work with that once we qualify a version of ESXi. So 99% of my testing happened in nested virtualization, right? I can quickly test out the solution. I can figure out like, hey, are these the feature sets that I'm interested in, to give feedback to VMware, to incorporate that into organization. And so very early on, nested virtualization was part of my key workflow, right? Every time there was a new version of ESXi, it would run in a VM. And so through that usage, for my day-to-day job, throughout my career, I realized like, hey, this is a very useful capability, not just for myself, but it can also help others quickly get started, right? Because if you think about our platform today, even in 2022, there's not a lot of value in learning how to install ESXi. There's certainly not a lot of value in things like upgrades and patching manually to get to a certain version. And so if I can help our customers or end user to get to the ability to deploy the software and configure so that they can start to solve their particular set of use cases. An example, if you want to play with NSX, you shouldn't have to be forced to figure out like, okay, I need to install ESX, I need to install vCenter, go through all that. You want to be able to get to a point where NSX is just available. You can start to get that value. Same with things like vSphere or Tanzu. And so I do spend a lot of time, with these new offerings such that somebody can, click of a button, run a script, and get to the point where the environment is, 99.9% configured. Right. That way you can come in, you can start playing with vSphere or Tanzu. You can understand the value proposition that it's going to give you and your organization. So you really learn about the technology and not necessarily how do you install the product. At some point in time, yeah, you probably need to know it. And if you've been using VMware for a really long time, you already know how to install it. So that part of it is not really that interesting. Right. And so that's really the piece that I primarily focused on. And so and my passion for automation and not having to do things by hand as much as possible, especially with these different environments, right? And so I've created a number of scripts. The nested ESXi appliance has been kind of that focus point that I can use, and I can literally use that and deploy any type of environment that I'm interested in. In fact, this has not only helped our customers, but I also have found that this has helped internal engineering and testing teams internally within VMware. They also use it and they rely on it as well. So when I don't have a particular version, they're like, hey, can you help build this version? Because it makes it so much easier for us to test, right? It's much easier to deploy, 64 nested ESXi VMs to test a 64 node cluster versus trying to find 64 physical hosts, right? And so there's just a lot of things that you can do with nested virtualization. And I think it's really endless possibilities. I mean, most recently I was doing some work with nested virtualization around some of the certificates and some of the trusting and the TPM stuff that, if you didn't have a physical piece of hardware or you had a limited amount of physical hardware capabilities, it's really difficult to kind of exercise those workflows. And with nested ESXi, it's like, hey, set this up, and all of a sudden you're using that particular feature almost immediately. So.
Could you tell us a little bit about the Apple virtualization? Fling's project, USB network native drives?
Yeah, there's a couple aspects of that. So yeah, I guess it's sort of like an expansion of sort of like the continue of the home lab exploration for me, and I'm always looking for new and exciting platforms. So I'm always on the lookout for new hardware platforms that can help give our customers an edge in terms of all the things I've talked about. I also think about sort of like what else makes it challenging for our customers when you think about home labs. And this is an interesting area because I spend so much time on it. A lot of the learnings, we're starting to see some of these applied towards things like edge computing, right? When you think about edge location, it used to be the case where like, hey, these are just, sites that don't have good internet connectivity. You don't have a data center rack. And so the piece of hardware that you can run out there may not always reflect a typical enterprise or data center grade piece of hardware. And, fast forward, a decade plus, you now see this prevalence of hardware platforms that may or may not be designed for the edge. I think more and more we're starting to see new systems focus on some of the constraints that edge brings. But a lot of the challenges that we saw in the early days, they still affect us today in many different shapes, ways, and fashion, right? When I look at some of the customer base that we work with at the edge, they have different types of connectivity. They don't always have, a network switch, for example. They don't always have 10 gigabit connectivity, for example, right? They might require more exotic network connectivity from things like satellites, because of just the remoteness of the environment. And so for all these different reasons, a lot of the work that I've done in the home lab space applies to kind of what we're seeing in this more broader sense of what's happening in the edge space. And so some of the work I've done there is to, networking becomes a big challenge. If you look at the historical nature of ESXi, it's an enterprise data center grade hypervisor. The focus has always been hardware that runs in the data center. 2 decades later, we find, and we have been seeing this trend for quite some time, right? A lot of it has been home lab driven, but I would also argue that we've been having a lot of customers actually doing this type of, running ESXi on not official hardware for a number of years. Whether it's in a submarine, whether it's in an oil platform, whether it's in space, in the sea, we've seen that, right? And so networking ends up being one of the first constraints is that, do I have a network adapter that ESXi understands? ESXi is not a general purpose, typical desktop operating system. So it may not have the compatibility you might expect, right? Because again, its lineage is coming from the enterprise data center. But what you can do, is to understand, what does that ecosystem look like? And so, USB-based NICs was something interesting. And I was very fortunate to have been connected to one of our engineers who's focused on USB-based NICs and said, hey, could we enable our community for those that have systems that maybe they just only have a single network adapter, or maybe they don't even have network adapters that are compatible, and give them the ability to expand and have more networking options. And so we created a fling, that allows a fair number of different types of devices. And this has been really useful, not only just for the x86 ESXi story, but we also have an ESXi on ARM story. And that has also been very useful for that ecosystem, especially when you look at the form factors like a Raspberry Pi and other systems that may not have all the connectivity that you might expect. We also did a similar fling for storage. Again, being very similar, there may be storage devices that may not be accessible to all users, especially when you think about edge locations or home locations where the hardware may not be enterprise grade, and just making a fling that can at least make some of those devices available so that it's consumable and users can leverage it. So that's some of the stuff that I've done in the recent years, just to kind of round out, the ability to just kind of consume our ESXi platform on ideally almost any system. You mentioned Apple as an example, right? A lot of people did not expect, VMware to kind of go into the space to help, the Apple ecosystem expand and really give the benefits that they've had for the past decade plus around, basic things like cloning operations, and being able to have really interesting lifecycle and capabilities for a virtual machine running as a VM, right? Customers are doing things like dev test, CI/CD build pipelines. And if you look at the different apps that you use today, there is definitely an iOS or mobile OS type of platform, and somebody needs to do development there, right? So just like you would do it for Windows and Linux, we see that for Apple. And that's why, in the early days, I spent a lot of time kind of helping those customers leverage the power of vSphere, just running on a different x86 form factor system.
What are your thoughts about Apple Silicon?
I think it's definitely quite interesting. I mean, Apple has definitely pushed the boundaries, on ARM in general, and has really shown the world what can be done when you have kind of this full integrated hardware software stack. And you certainly see this trend continue even to the public cloud, with organizations like AWS, Azure, and Google all providing sort of ARM capabilities. And obviously even VMware understands the space quite well. And we even have projects like Project Monterey, which is really our first productization of our ARM technology. And so, again, I think over time, you're going to see applications start to change, and different types of applications will have different types of requirements. And I think you'll start to see, more of these scenarios, and the capabilities of ARM has certainly grown quite significantly from the early days, where it can now be more financially sound to run a certain class of applications, especially data center space. So I think definitely a lot of interesting things happening in the Apple ecosystem with Apple Silicon. So I'm certainly an observer from the outside. I don't have any insider knowledge on that, but just kind of observing, what they've been able to achieve in such a very short amount of time. I do feel that, longer term, we will start to see more and more workloads that are going to be ARM centric. So I think from that point of view, from a learning standpoint, things like ESXi ARM, Project Monterey, these are all really interesting set of technologies and projects to keep an eye on.
What is a home lab for you?
I guess for me, if I had to kind of put it in like one sentence or one answer, it's my playground, right? It's where you go and explore, try things out, things that may not always work out, which is perfectly fine, right? And so I think this is a good place for you to try, learn, and fail. That way, when you do need to take these techniques and things that you're learning and applying that to your actual job, hopefully those are going to be successful. But I would say a home lab is really, your playground, and really make it a playground for yourself where you can really try things without any real serious consequences.
What one piece of advice would you give for beginner home labbers?
I would say, start small. Don't focus on what others have done necessarily. A lot of us have, it's taken us a number of years and obviously some level of investment to get to, whatever the home lab nirvana is for you. And home lab isn't just about you owning a piece of hardware that resides somewhere that you can have access to, right? I don't think we really touched upon this, but like home labs can be, things like VMware hands-on labs, where you need to periodically have access to, some set of VMware products. It's completely free. It's hosted in the cloud. There's literally zero investments on your end other than, you just signing up for an account. That can be a home lab for you because maybe that's just all you need. Now, obviously, there are some constraints with that, where you're not going to be able to, connect to the internet, from a hands-on lab. You wouldn't be able to upload and download files. So it does have some constraints. Home labs can be something that's completely hosted in the cloud, that's on demand. We have these offerings like VMware Cloud and AWS, where you can basically get billed on an hourly basis, right? You get a full SDDC, fully deployed in under hours time, and maybe you just need it for a very short amount of time. And you don't want to have that huge investment because maybe for the rest of the year, it's mostly sitting around and kind of running idle. And like I said, also for home labs, it doesn't have to be super fancy. I'm able to do a lot of different things with a pretty small footprint of infrastructure. But I would say maybe from an advice standpoint is that whatever you invest in it, that's really going to be your return on investment, right? And so if you're not going to invest in it, if you decide to buy a piece of hardware and you're not putting in, a certain amount of finances into it, then obviously you're not going to be able to get to do certain aspects of the physical piece of hardware and stuff, right? And so I always ask folks to really think about this as a true investment and investing in yourself from a career standpoint. And however you feel you should be investing in yourself is how you should kind of think about home labs. And I think that would be the one piece of advice I would really give folks who are just getting started with it. And then really from there, you certainly have many, many opportunities to enhance, change, and make that solution fit the needs that you have. But you can always start small.
You're well known for automation. Tell us a little bit more and why we should.
Yeah, I guess from cool things. I mean, I consider all the automation that I've done and also just what I've seen, all of it should be awesome. So, folks should definitely get into automation if they can. I still talk to a lot of customers who are still a little bit of either afraid or haven't been able to find time to invest in themselves to really learn about automation. If you look at what automation gives an individual, not only is it going to help you in your career standpoint, but excuse me, it allows you to also do more with less. And that's really important these days, right? When you look at sort of the scale of the infrastructure, it's only going to get larger and larger. And I don't know too many organizations there that are saying, hey, let's hire as many people as we can. And so, your time is very valuable, right? And so, treat your time wisely and where you spend that time, right? And if you're spending too much of your time doing really basic tasks, especially tasks that are really repetitive, it means that you're not able to use that time to advance yourself from a career standpoint, to focus on other technologies. There's a lot to learn out there, whether it's networking, Kubernetes, security. But if you're focused too much on like maybe provisioning VMs in a very manual fashion, you might want to consider thinking about what automation can you do to make that simpler. The other benefit of automation is obviously consistency, right? And so if you start to do all this manual work and you find that like, hey, I missed a step there, it means that you're now having to take your time to go back and fix problems, or more importantly, it could cause issues later down the road, right? And so really think about automation as this thing that's going to help you. And some of the cool things that I've done is like sort of that, USB to SDDC, that is literally years and all these different techniques I've learned, right, all kind of concentrated in one particular project. So although that's a really cool outcome, and yeah, some customers may have that use case, to me, what's more important is the smaller pieces of things that you've learned, and doing a little bit at a time, right? And so I think for me, it was really just getting started with really basic things. And this is something that I've talked about in the past, getting into automation and APIs, is things like reporting, right? I'm sure everybody has a report that you need to run for somebody. And really that equates to basically doing kind of Git APIs. So that way you're not doing anything destructive to your environment. And just understanding the products. It doesn't even have to be VMware products, right? There's a lot of other, product solutions that you may also get benefit of automation. And we just don't spend enough time kind of exploring that and really finding time, right? 1 hour out of the week, maybe 1 day out of the week, we're able to sit down and just think about the things that you do that is repetitive, and how can you improve yourself and really build up that skill set, because it's really going to help you over time, and start to make you a differentiated, individual when you think about it from a career standpoint. So yeah, that's what I would kind of recommend folks kind of getting started.
How do you home labbing? I think you're laser focused on your task. Before you start, you already see your results in front of your eyes.
I wouldn't necessarily say that. It may sound polished, and you may see certain blog posts. And so I think that's, again, that's part of the benefits of them, like a home lab, right? Like if you don't know automation, guess what? You can learn automation. You can use your home lab as a place to explore. I'm very fortunate to be able to interact with a lot of customers, our entire field organization, and I hear all sorts of interesting requests and challenges that come in, especially unique challenges that I've never heard of before, right? And by understanding the products, which is a result of, being able to use my home lab in so many different ways as a customer of VMware for many, many years, but also spending a lot of time in automation, knowing the product APIs and its capabilities, then I can in theory, I can answer almost any of these questions that come in from our customers of what they're trying to solve for. And so sometimes I do get some interesting requests from our customers in our field of like, hey, I need to do this thing. I don't know how to do it. Or I need to do this one thing. I don't think the products can do it. And so, these types of things are always interesting. Obviously, my day job is focused on other aspects of the VMware portfolio, and especially cloud services. But ultimately, I always enjoy problem solving. Right. And so if I had to kind of summarize, the home lab stuff, the automation, and just some of the things I've worked on, in the 10 plus years that I've been at VMware, it just boils down to I enjoy problem solving. And that's just a personal thing for me. And so the problem solving could be like, hey, how do I install this piece of software on this hardware? How do I automate this particular task? Or like, hey, how do I get to this particular outcome? And it's not always successful, right? I think a lot of people don't see the failures. I spend lots of time trying things out. More recently, I was doing some automation, leveraging, vSphere guest customization. And there is a piece of technology or framework out there called Cloud Init. And for those that are not familiar with Cloud Init, it's an industry standard for customizing Linux operating system. And it's generally something that you would run sort of independent of, VMware technology, right? You would install an operating system, and then you would really use this framework sort of outside of the typical VMware vSphere workflow. And in 7.0 U3, we actually built a native integration so that if you're a Cloud Init user, we make it very easy for you to basically provide your Cloud Init configuration natively within the vSphere guest customization. And what that means is that instead of having to use this as a separate workflow that's not connected, we make it very easy for you to tie this into the vSphere ecosystem so that you get those benefits. And so I did not know that we actually released this feature. And I've used Cloud Init before, but not as much and extensively. So, I spent some time learning the APIs that allowed you to kind of consume this functionality. It's not something that I knew how it worked. And there was a lot of trial and error, right? And so a lot of people don't see that. I was actually at a point where like, oh man, I don't know if I'm ever going to get this to work. And I have a lot of those things. And many times some things just don't work, right? And in the early days of my career, before I had kids, I just kick the tires, try things out, see if something works, see how this particular feature works or doesn't work and what are its constraints. And so to me, a lot of that is just problem solving. That's just what I enjoy, right? And so when you ask like, oh, do I know it's going to work? I don't know. Right. In some cases, I really don't know, like, is it going to be a yes or no or maybe? And so I enjoy kind of exploring and learning simultaneously. So I think that has always helped me. And so I think if somebody is interested in learning and trying things out, home lab, automation, all these things are all interconnected. It's not like if you just do home lab, you're going to get a particular outcome, right? I can certainly find people who don't enjoy learning. They can set up this home lab and they'll never use it, or they may not get creative in the things that they may want to use it for.
William, thank you so much for joining, and thank you so much for all the hard work you have done. Especially thank you for sharing on your blog.
Yeah, no, it's my pleasure. It's great to be able to share this with the community and continue sharing. Very fortunate for that. And like I said, every day I'm still learning. So I hope that the takeaway for your audience is like, you can always keep learning. There are definitely ways to leverage these different technologies and capabilities, but at the end of the day, it's an investment in yourself, right? And so these are just tools. How you use the tools will give you certain types of outcomes. And I'm just glad I can be part of this community and continue to share and learn every single day.
Thank you, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Home Labbers Podcast. Our passion is to interview the leading IT experts and get tech enthusiasts all the information they need to become an expert. So if you run at-home enterprise hardware and software, and you like tinkering and self-learning, then you've found your new podcast. Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review. And we'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit up the website at VOnDo.tech, on Twitter at #VOnDoTrending and #HomeLab. See you next time on the Home Labbers Podcast.